This is Donald J. Trump, President of the United States. Mark Thompson is a huge loser. His show, very bad, weak, soft. But if you're interested in crap and you're a communist, you can go to edge-show.com. I don't recommend it.
Oh, okay. I want to thank you for all the ways that you support my friends on the Edge podcast. And if you haven't already, why don't you show your support and subscribe? What's the matter with you? Go to Edge Show. Oh, that's Edge dash. What's with the dash? Stupid. All right, I want to thank you for all the ways that you support my friends on the Edge podcast. Show your support and leave something on their website, edge-show.com. Stupid. Why is there a dash?
Edge-show.com. The Edge with Mark Thompson.
Hi, it's Mark, and welcome. We have stuff to catch up on. Before we do, let me tell you what's ahead. We'll talk to the son of the founder of the National Enquirer. And as journalism and news coverage gets more tabloidy, you can trace the roots back to the National Enquirer. As digital media began to blow up, it in essence was just a transfer to the digital forum. I mean, you think about the tabloid TV shows through time, like Hard Copy, A Current Affair, Entertainment Tonight, Inside Edition. All of these shows are just extensions of what the Enquirer was already doing. We talk about the Enquirer, we talk about how it took off and decisions made and critical news stories like the O.J. Simpson trial, for example. News stories that sort of redefined what the Enquirer was. But his family's tale is fascinating, and it involves mobsters and New York. It's all in a book that he's written called The Deeds of My Fathers, How My Grandfather and Father Built New York and Created the Tabloid World of Today. Our guest, Paul Pope, will join us, and J. Elvis Weinstein joins for the conversation with Paul Pope. And now quickly into the email. We're edgewithmarkthompson@gmail.com. edgewithmarkthompson@gmail.com. Jonas from Canada wrote us about supporting the show by buying things on Amazon through our website. You know, if you click through edge-show.com, there's like Amazon banners, or if you're on your phone, maybe you'll click on an episode of our show on the website. Again, edge-show.com. And if anywhere it says Amazon, if you click through, it's the same Amazon as usual, but we get a little piece of whatever you spend. So, you know, you hear me say that if you've listened to the show before. I try to say it most shows. And Jonas is asking from Canada, are we set up so we get something on the Canadian Amazon? Jonas, I have passed it on to our guys, and they tell me that they're going to try to set it up. Of course, if history's a guide, nothing will happen. Now, we kind of held off this episode trying to get Michael Shore in to talk some politics. There's just so much going on. But he's been so elusive, and just schedules and logistics are very, very tough. So what we're going to do is this. This episode doesn't have my conversation with Michael, but I'm going to have it in the next couple of days, and I will post it as a supplemental episode later this week. So you will have it. Those of you who've written to me, who've commented on the conversations I've had with Michael in the past, I want to try to keep him as a continuing feature, and I'll drop it as a separate, as I say, standalone conversation later this week, because I'm dying to share my thoughts with you and Michael on any number of subjects. Julian Assange, perhaps front and center, possible war in Iran, possible war in Venezuela, the politics of Washington, so much to talk about, so we'll do that as a separate episode. Thank you for all the ways you support this show. Thank you for 5-star reviews. You've been very generous on iTunes and on Stitcher. Any place you have a chance to rate the show, we appreciate the top rating. I appreciate a word or two, like listen to it when I can, love the conversations, enjoy Mark. It's good even though I don't like Mark. Whatever you want to say, I appreciate your support. That's it. Preamble's over. Let's get started.
This is The Edge.
The advantage, it means.
They let guy just spit on me for no reason.
That's horrible.
Is there some comfort in uncertainty, do you think?
You're a degenerate.
Because Australian Shepherds need action.
Wow. Yeah.
This is The Edge.
That's a self-loathing term that I use.
Oh, got it.
Paul David Pope joins us. The book is The Deeds of My Fathers, How My Grandfather and Father Built New York and Created the Tabloid World of Today. Hi, Paul. Welcome.
Mark, thanks for having me. Hi, Jay.
Hi there.
The story of the National Enquirer and getting into the press in New York City, this authentically Italian family that came from building, I guess, something of a media empire in Italy, right?
Yes, in fact, here's what happened, Mark. My grandfather, Generoso Pope Sr., emigrated at the age of 15 to this country. He didn't speak a word of English. He landed on Ellis Island. and he spent his first night on a park bench. I mean, he had literally $10 in his pocket. He then went on to the sand pits. He worked in the sand pits in Long Island, worked his way up, and within a decade, he took over a company called Colonial Sand and Stone, which became the largest sand and gravel company in the nation, which supplied the concrete for most of New York City, its landmarks, everything. And in fact, he was instrumental in the ready-made concrete mix, where they actually mix it on the way to the job site. And it was interesting because the trucks at those times and the barges all had the Italian flag on it, the Italian flag. So he was the most successful Italian immigrant ever. But he didn't just stop there. He then, my grandfather, Generoso Pope Sr., went on to buy newspapers. He bought in 1928 a newspaper called Il Progresso Italo-Americano, which became like the Bible for all the immigrants coming over. So there's the immigrant part of this as well. He then bought other newspapers for power and influence. He then bought radio stations. He bought a radio station called WHOM, which he liked, by the way, a lot.
Just because of these acquisitions you talk about, as I recall, for example, in the case of the publishing acquisitions, oftentimes these places didn't look like they were going to be moneymakers.
No, and many times not. But the thing is, think of it like Jeff Bezos buying the Washington Post.
Right.
They're not buying it to make money. They're buying it for power and influence. Obviously, my grandfather at the time had plenty of money, so he needed the publications as a way for power and influence. It was a way of positioning, which my father did too, which I'll get to later. So they were masters at positioning, my grandfather and father, masters at positioning things in their lifetime. And I say three things: educate, entertain, market, inspire. And they both did that to a large degree.
And what was his agenda in getting the influence and power of these publications?
Well, listen, I mean, he had relationships, for example. So he elected president. So it went to President Roosevelt, for example. He was the head of the DNC of the Italian division for Roosevelt.
Okay.
So it wasn't just enough for my grandfather to have power and money. He wanted influence. And the Colonial Sand and Stone gave him enormous amount of wealth, but he needed the influence, and the paper is what gave him the influence. And that also led him to a dictator that we know called Mussolini. So he established pretty strong ties with Mussolini. He would go back and forth to Italy. And in fact, my father, this is really interesting, sat on Mussolini's lap when he was 11 years old. Can you believe it?
Wow.
I mean, that's outrageous.
That was the best time to get him. Yeah.
Right? Yeah, before all the madness, right? I mean, and then, of course, after Mussolini and all that happened, my grandfather had to denounce Mussolini, and it was tough times for my grandfather, but he survived, and he went on, and he passed in 1950. So, and then, let me tell you a little bit about the book. So the name of the book, as you mentioned, was The Deeds of My Fathers. And one of the parallels that it's uncanny, but in every generation, the patriarch of the family chooses a favorite son. This is a blessing and a curse to be the anointed one. So with my grandfather, he chose my father, which created an enormous amount of sibling rivalry, even with his own biological mother. And then my father did the same thing with me, even though I didn't ask to be anointed. And again, the same thing happened. So history does tend to repeat itself, typically, not just in families, but in general, as you know. And so it's uncanny, the parallels here. And in telling this story, when I started this story with the National Enquirer because, of course, I know it so well. I grew up with my father. I could, recite that kind of stuff in my sleep, by osmosis, right?
I want to stop you right there because the birth of the National Enquirer is a really cool story. And the birth of a lot of these things that you've sort of alluded to along the way here, even as you're just kind of getting us all acquainted, are really cool as well. Like having to borrow the money from a mobster to get sufficient funds for the paper and making sure that the mobster says, yeah, but now I want you to never mention the mob in the paper. Isn't that,
right.
that one of those kinds of things? But what I want to ask you about your childhood, because you mentioned the Enquirer and growing up with it, what was the feeling to be so associated with this thing that was a tabloid, but it was a super high-profile tabloid? Was it a cool thing to have the Enquirer so much a part of your life?
The quick answer is no. I was teased an enormous amount. I, in fact, spent a lot of my childhood defending, as you can imagine, my father's baby. It was his baby, the National Enquirer. And to a large extent, because I worked at the paper since I was 10. I knew the business so well. And until we broke the Gary Hart story in 1985, we had, credibility, instant credibility. The mainstream press, wow, these guys are real, But until then, everybody thought the National Enquirer, two-headed babies, aliens, UFOs landing in your backyard, all that madness, right? The Loch Ness Monster.
It was some of that, right? But that's not quite fair to what it did, or was it all that?
Well, in the beginning, it was some of that. So let me give you the history. My father bought it. It was called the New York Enquirer in 1952. It had a circulation of 17,000. He was out drinking with some of his buddies, his pals, that night, and they ran into somebody and said, "Hey, I know of this failing Hearst publication for sale called the New York Enquirer." He bought it. He went to Uncle Frank, who was his biological godfather.
And Uncle Frank had a couple of mob connections, right?
A few, right? Yeah, he was one of the top, probably top 5 of the day.
Right.
And so he went to Uncle Frank and said, he borrowed the money. He bought it. He then changed it to a broadsheet, Mark, then to a racing sheet. He tried all these different things. And circulation was creeping up, but not fast enough for my father. My father wanted more. So one day, he sees this really morbid, horrible accident on the side of the road in New York City with like a decapitated head. And my father didn't like that kind of stuff. But what he noticed was everybody gawking. He then started to run gore and all these crazy things, and the circulation went up. He then started to – my father said one thing, give the people what they want, and he gave it to them in spades. He then started the UFOs and some of that. It went up a little more, but not enough. One of the master strokes or positioning of Gene Pope was getting it into the supermarket chains. And this was around the year 1971 to 1972. And that's when he had to tone the paper down a little bit. And we had a mixture of celebrity news, human interest. So, we couldn't run, decapitated heads and blood all over the cover, and the supermarket chains wouldn't allow it to be sold in their supermarkets. But he did another amazing thing, and I have to tell you, this to me even almost trumps the other. And what he did was he put the racks at every checkout counter that we see in the supermarket today. They weren't there before.
So he had control over putting those racks there?
Yes, he organized a deal with all the supermarket chains with his political connections to get all the racks at the eye level when you're checking out and getting groceries in the grocery store. That was one of the best, genius moves that I think he's ever made in his career.
And when you say
he had many, but that was just, as we see it today, of course the times have changed. People are receiving news instantly, from their phone or their iPad. So, weekly newspapers are sort of a thing of the past. But listen, 20, 30, 40 years ago, that was the thing,
So what I'm curious about, what was the deal that he made with the magazine racks? Did he then control the content of all the racks, or
Yes, in fact, he controlled the content, but not only for the Enquirer, but also for other magazines as well.
Right, but they had to go through
other things in the racks as well.
They had to go through him to get onto his racks.
Absolutely.
Oh, wow.
No. That was what he did. It was just so amazing. I mean, and keep in mind, like you, I say this with respect, and my father was the same way. We weren't into gossip and celebrities and all that. So, here's a man that graduated MIT in 2.5 years with an engineering degree. He was in the CIA in the very division that his grandfather created, my grandfather, General Pope Sr., started a division called psychological warfare.
Now tell that story, because that's a great story, because he actually did that to get out of going to war, right?
He did. In fact, so he served in the CIA, so he didn't have to go to war. And he really didn't like it. So, but, for him it was a good option. And he just didn't like the whole bureaucracy of the CIA. So he went on to do other things. And that's when he found and heard about this Enquirer, the New York Enquirer for sale. What's interesting, though, Mark, is this is the story of the century. It's The Godfather crossed with Citizen Kane. Let me tell you more about the characters involved in this. It wasn't just Frank Costello. Let me name some of the most amazing guys in this. You had Albert Anastasia, Murder Incorporated. You had a lot of big gangsters.
But when you talk about these mobsters, let's be clear. These are mobsters in your family, or they're kind of kissing cousins to your family, or where were they in this?
Well, he's in the... let me just answer.
Yeah, Jay Elvis.
The mix of the construction and grocery business says that there's plenty of mutual interests. Going on here.
Yeah. No, obviously they were intertwined, but I was just curious if they were blood relatives or just sort of consulting, if you will.
Well, they weren't blood, but like Jay, like you said, it was a tenure of the times, right? You couldn't do what my grandfather did without running into these characters. I mean, it was just part of the landscape.
Right.
Sure.
So there was no doubt. So you had, of course, Frank Costello, the prime minister of the underworld. You had Albert Anastasia, Murder Incorporated. You had Joe Profaci. I mean, the names, and these were the biggest guys. And they were all friends of my grandfather. So they owed him a lot of favors. You know, you scratch one another's back, right? So let me put it this way. You couldn't do business in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s without dealing with these people.
Right.
There was just no way.
But in your family, that enabled a bunch of things. As you say, it was just kind of the cost of doing business, these relationships, and oftentimes they worked in your favor.
They did. I will tell you, though, it's one of those things because we were not, made men, and we weren't a mob connected at all. But the stories, and because of the reputation and because of who they are, it's sort of, and that as well as sort of haunted me through the years. And people will say, well, you know, your father started it with mob money, which means you're a mob guy. And, you know, you hear this, you know, people have this, again, this morbid fascination with organized crime, right? You know,
Right.
And in fact, when I did this book, The Deeds of My Fathers, they wanted before I had it published, they wanted to embellish the organized crime thing. I said, no, it's enough. We don't need to embellish it. Just leave it.
You definitely don't need to embellish it. It's throughout.
We had a girl that used to work for us. She worked for us for, I guess she was an editor for about 10 years. Her name was Judith Reagan.
Sure.
And she became a publisher, you know, a nice lady. And she wanted to do it and just make it this whole mob thing. And I said, listen, we really don't, as you said, need to exaggerate this. It's fine the way it is. Let's just tell the truth. Anyway, so it took me a while to get it done, you know, with integrity.
But let me just stop you. I don't mean to dwell on the mob thing. I'll sound like Judith Reagan after a while. But because there was money borrowed, or they helped to lift up this project, the initial publishing project, there were strings attached, right? They also made demands when it came time to talk about what was actually going to be in the Enquirer. Isn't that right?
They did. In fact, they didn't want anything ever published about them. You know, once you're a part of them, they never let you go.
They were concerned about the reputation of Italian Americans on some level, right?
Sure. I mean, there's no doubt. I mean, and understand in those days, not now, but Italians in those days were very unified, like, you know, the Jewish people are today. It's just today they're not the Italians, but they were then. And, you know, if you broke that code of honor and silence, and you know, they did pretty bad things. We had in the union, one of the truck drivers was actually murdered in one of the trucks, which is in the book. So there were a lot of reasons that my father moved to Florida, and he didn't want the affiliation with them anymore. Not that they're bad people, but he had just had enough, and it was a lot of different reasons, but that was one, you know, to kind of move away from all that, to get away from all that, and he picked a small town here in Lantana that he made home to the National Enquirer, which was interesting. So it worked out for him.
And did that in fact extract him from the mob sphere?
It did to some extent, but not totally. Listen, we had friends here locally that, you know, were mobsters and organized crime, and you can never really totally get away from it, I guess is the point. But I think he was so much surrounded by it in New York City at the time. I think he had just had enough. And, you know, I think it was just time. So I think he was happier here. But yeah, there were still some characters around here for sure.
And so you grow up in this family. The Enquirer becomes this thing that grows and evolves, as you say, gains legitimacy even to a degree, and certainly gains profitability. Yeah? Oh,
totally. I mean, you know, we had a slogan, okay? We moved here, my father moved his business down to 71. And Mark and Jay, we had a slogan, 3 and 73, 4 and 74, 5 and 75, 6 and 76, 7 and 77, eclipsing with the Elvis issue, which was the pinnacle of tabloid journalism in my father's newspaper. It's when we got the Elvis story, and it was the biggest story we ever broke.
Now, the Elvis story, tell everyone what that is.
Elvis Presley, when he passed, my father sent a team of people. This is in 1977. He sent a team of reporters. I mean, 40 reporters. They took over an entire hotel in Memphis, and they started spending hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars. And they interviewed every family member. They got to just about everybody. My father had this innate intuition, and he wanted a picture of Elvis in the coffin. And it didn't matter. Anything else wouldn't work. And finally, we got a second cousin of Elvis to go in and snap a picture with one of those really small cameras. And he took a picture, and that became the picture that we saw on the cover, just about everywhere at the time, of Elvis in the coffin. And that became our biggest seller. In fact, we did another print run after that of a couple million. And we could have printed 20 million. It would have sold that many. And that was the height of the National Enquirer.
What was the...
and he knew that's what people wanted to see.
What was the second cousin paid to take the picture?
I think it was about 25,000.
Okay.
So the paper made enormous, to what you said, Mark, the paper it was a cash cow. It made a lot of money for a long time. And we had a pass-along readership of about 5. So for a solid decade, we hit about 20 million people. That's a lot.
And it seems like from an outsider perspective, like once the Gary Hart thing happened, there was this thing with the Enquirer where it's like, now it could be true.
Listen, even with the monkey business photo, even with all that, and even to this day, people will always say, no matter what, oh, that's garbage, that's nonsense, the National Enquirer, it's the dirt, it's this, it's that. But
as long as you broke a real one every few years, it seemed like that kept that enough of a balance of it could be true. They get a story once in a while,
Well, I always I like this, the Men in Black movie, right? In the movie, the first one.
Right.
They're at in the city, and they're at a kiosk and buying a newspaper to find out about the UFOs and something, and they picked up the National Enquirer because that's where the news was true,
Right.
But let me tell you this is really, really interesting, Mark. We had the best fact checkers, the best journalists. In fact, we weren't sued that often. The difference is when we were sued, it was highly, highly, highly publicized. So, everybody heard about it, and people just automatically thought, oh, man, they're sued. Regular newspapers got sued hundreds of times more than we did. We only lost one suit. That was to Carol Burnett, and that was to an empathetic jury. And, again, keep in mind, too, I have to paint this picture because without this I don't think this would be important. But my father, with the CIA, and he ran his newspaper room like the CIA, and those characters, by the way, he maintained his relationship with the agency until his death. And because
did the agency ever produce? Did the agency ever, or his pals at the agency ever produce any intelligence that your dad might have followed up on and led to a story?
It went both ways. You've heard the term catch and kill, I'm sure, quite a bit lately.
Sure.
Because of all the Stormy Daniels and Trump and all that. It existed. My father, many times they would trade information. Keep in mind also that we had the best journalists, and sometimes they would get things that the agency wouldn't. So he did maintain that relationship. So 100%. We had the highest kill rate to this day of any newspaper or magazine ever.
What does that mean, the highest kill rate? Explain that.
Sure. A kill rate is when you kill a story. So about 80% of the stories that my father, the reporters wanted to get would be killed. So maybe 20% would make the newspaper. Again, the budgets were bigger back then, but, the typical newspaper then, guys, was running maybe at a 20% kill rate, 10%. I mean, you weren't just acquiring information to not do anything with it. That would be insane, My father, perhaps with some of it, not all of it, was doing other things.
But when you kill a story, you kill it for any number of reasons, right? As you say,
you
not just because
you don't like it, you don't think it's good, but you wouldn't do it 70 or 80% of the time.
Sure.
Maybe you do it because you didn't like the reporting job. There's a myriad of reasons, but
I assume that there was situations where you would kill a story and trade trade it for a different story from the same person.
Sometimes, yes.
I mean, when you think about the stuff that your family was moving through, I'm talking about news events. You referenced the Rosenbergs, like a high-profile trial like that, an espionage trial where people are being tried for where they're accused of giving up state secrets, and then there are pictures associated with that. I think there was a photograph of one of them in the electric chair. I don't know if it was, but anyway, I don't know why that jumped out at me, but I know that your family's world sort of was paralleling all of these huge news events, and that's what makes this story so compelling, I think, that oddly, then it evolves to this Enquirer that we know of today, and it has moved into the digital age. But I mean, even before that, it became, as Jay says, sort of this arm of legitimacy, of legitimate journalism.
Not only that, think of it, everything that my father created, everything you see today from the internet, it has his imprint on it. I mean, he's changed society and the world by what he did. I don't think even he imagined the amount that he affected that. I will say one thing to that end, though, that we are living now in times when you look at the Bezos and Trump and using the paper for self-gain that Pecker did, and extortion and blackmail and self-interest magazines, and it's just, they've destroyed it. But nonetheless, I mean, it's still, look at how much it's in the news in the last, decade. I mean, it is. I don't think my father even could have imagined this. I mean, nobody, even I. There's times I can't. I just can't believe it.
Well,
every time I turn around, it's in the news again. So,
well, before you even get to today and the whole Trump thing, let's get back to and Jay Elvis is sort of alluding to this a bit. The legitimacy followed certain stories. So I remember in the O.J. Simpson trial, the Enquirer was viewed as almost a paper of record. A lot of stuff was coming out of the world of tabloid journalism that was now making its way into the mainstream press.
Absolutely. And I think that started with Gary Hart, and it went to O.J., John Edwards, on down the line.
Michael Jackson, I like
Michael Jackson,
yeah.
Even at some point, I think the paper was up for a Pulitzer. They didn't get it, But no, the Enquirer kind of became the antithesis of what people thought. It became real news and real journalism. In fact, as you just said, people started taking it so seriously that they would turn to it, just like in the Men in Black, for wow, this is what's happening. And the truth is, we would break stories all the time that no one else would ever break. No one would get the news that we were able to get. We just would never stop. We would leave no stone unturned, and that's something my father set up. And there's another thing he did that was brilliant called checkbook journalism. And that was never done before, where you pay a source for information. The tricky part of that is to do it in today's landscape. Again, you have to assume you have to have at least 2 to 3 sources, right? You could have one source, they could be lying. You have to corroborate it and make sure it's true. But anyway, my father invented checkbook journalism.
Well, and it's been picked up upon, the Today Show, Good Morning America, a lot of these big network shows, a lot of the morning shows, because the morning shows tend to do these longer form interviews with celebrities. They have to pay oftentimes for a lot of these bookings. That's what people don't realize. So when they get these exclusives, those exclusives come at a price. And I really feel as though it was your dad who sort of set that tone. I mean, you could play both sides of it, like it's a good thing or a bad thing. But I'm just saying, I think your dad was a trailblazer that way.
Absolutely. I totally agree. He was.
Roy Cohn, you have a whole chapter in your book dedicated to Roy Cohn. He's someone else whose name has now been floated again because of his relationship to Trump and the way Trump sort of looked up to Roy Cohn. Explain Roy Cohn and how he works into this whole story.
My father in New York City growing up was best friends with Roy Cohn. He would pal around with Roy constantly.
They went to school together, was it?
They went to school together.
Yeah.
And as you know, Roy's father was a judge, and they just ran in the same circles. And, listen, Roy Cohn to some extent was a fixer for my father, a little bit, as he was for Trump for a while. So, I mean... What
kind of stuff would your dad need to get fixed, do you think?
I can't tell you all of that, but I mean...
That's why we have fixers, Mark. Come on.
That's why they have fixers. So guys like you don't ask questions like that, Mark.
Yeah. There were a couple times my father was unhappy with some things and needed some things and some legitimate handling, if you will, so to speak, and he turned to Roy to do it.
Right, because nothing says legitimate handling like Roy Cohn.
Right. And, Roy was able to finesse it in a way perhaps that the other people would not have,
And so where was your family in the McCarthy era when Roy Cohn was working for McCarthy? And I'm just curious because of the Mussolini thing, and where were they accused of un-Americanism at any point?
I don't think so, no. I don't think so. You mean our family?
Yeah.
There was a time with my grandfather a little bit, and perhaps my father, but not so much. And again, they had this is the important thing here, it's follow the money, and the power. They had the influence and the power to get out of it and to come out unscathed, again, because of their political connections.
Gotcha.
But I want to make another point. I have gone on. I started a thing called the Pope Files in the Pope Media Center. So after my father passed, when I was doing this book, I thought, all right, I'm going to do 50 interviews and blah, blah, blah. I'm 1,000 interviews into this thing. I, like my father, have left no stone unturned. I actually have interviews. I'm the only one that has this. That's why everything that's been done from MSNBC was recently done, A&E, PBS, they all come to me because I have this amazing historical archive. I have interviews with Roy Cohn when he was alive, my father when he was alive, Frank Costello. So I went back even after I acquired all this information, pictures, video, presidential archives, CIA files, everything. And I acquired information. We had 2 disgruntled reporters that attempted to do a story, and they interviewed people, and they did this. This is back in the 60s and 70s. I acquired their information, and I also acquired my father hired a reporter to husband and wife team reporters to do a story on his life, and I acquired all of their information as well. So, I mean, I'm sitting here literally on a treasure trove, and listen, I have enough for 30 years of TV, scripted, unscripted, docu-series. I mean, it's on and on and on. Feature film, what I have, nobody has. So it's been a long process, and what's really interesting, though, is I'm really glad I did it. At the time, everybody's like, Paul, stop. Man, it's enough. You got 500. That's enough. You don't need to do more. And I kept going. I was compulsive about it. I said, no, let's acquire that. Let's get it all. And I'm really happy now that I have this archive. I'm telling you, it's priceless.
Well, you've pointed out in your book that you have initially many of these stories, because obviously they, in a sense, predated your ability to write stuff down or anybody else's ability to. And when I say ability, I guess they could have written it down, but my point is that it just wasn't in the culture of the exchange of these stories for anybody to write this down or record it. So there's sort of an oral history that follows your family initially, but then, of course, clearly what they did, their achievements and their relationships, that's all been recorded. I mean, that is to say, you can see that. It evolved to this place where you enter the picture, and the National Enquirer became this thing that you were dealing with. And just take us to that, like to modern-ish day. I'm not talking about the digital revolution is a different thing, but I'm just talking about you involved in the National Enquirer and sort of having lived and breathed the National Enquirer for so long.
I mean, so I started working at the paper when I was 10, loading papers on the truck. We had a printing plant in Pompano. So I was actively involved until my father passed, until 1988. And so I was there for a lot of the biggest breaking stories and how we got the information. So I was intimately involved with the process, how it worked. The energy of the newsroom, I mean, was amazing. I mean, it was how a newsroom was, as you pictured it in like a great movie, right? The energy was electric. The people, the reporters, the extent we went to get stories was amazing. And again, growing up in this culture, if you will, was interesting because, as you said, I was not one to sit in the checkout line and pick it up. Not to be mean, I'm not, because we had a demographic called the Missy Smiths, right? They would buy it, the women, middle-aged women going into the supermarkets. But I particularly didn't follow celebrities, nor did my father. But again, he gave Mark the people what they wanted. And if they wanted celebrity news, he gave it to them. He did something else that was interesting, though. He realized that the movie star that was in a movie perhaps once a year didn't have the coverage of a TV star. So we ran a lot of TV stars on the cover. And those copies many times sold more than the movie star, if you will, because they were in the TVs back then, before we had the computers as much and the phones and all that stuff. So those copies really, he had his fingers on the pulse and he knew what would sell. And this is a man that, basically after he moved here, became somewhat of a recluse and a hermit. I mean, he never left a 17-mile radius ever. So that's a whole other part of the story. But, yeah, he became somewhat of a recluse and a hermit. And yet he knew what people wanted to read, and he had his fingers on the pulse.
And was there ever, was there an ethic about, certainly the National Enquirer wasn't the first to invade celebrity privacy. There were papers before that doing that, but for a time the Enquirer, and now probably TMZ more than anybody, was sort of the purveyor of that, hiding in the bushes kind of photojournalism.
There's no doubt we did push the envelope, perhaps invented it to some extent, right? However, there were, and I've said this many times, there were lines we just didn't cross. I mean, we again, we didn't chase people through tunnels and kill them.
Right.
There were just lines. I mean, even journalistic, ethical lines we just didn't cross.
Like what were big lines?
Well, let me give them to you.
Okay.
We didn't use a paper for self-gain, extortion, blackmail, to bring it present day. even if we wanted a story, we never blackmailed somebody to get it. We didn't try to extort them to get it. We either got it or we didn't get it. It was a real, get the story. In the old-fashioned investigative sense of a reporter, you have to get the story. Now, the paper has turned from in my father's day when he was at the helm, guys, it was let's get the story. Now it's a follow the money, whether it's he's chasing the Saudi money, Pecker, or whatever it may be. I don't know. I don't have proof of that, but it's completely changed the tone of it, what he's using it for, versus what it was. So it's completely different now than what it was, and that's a shame, but it is what it is. It's not atypical of what you would expect a corporate person to come in and do, I suppose, right? They would bleed the cash out of the company. They would take it public, and take the money from the investors and run it into the ground. I mean, look, our country and our world is built a lot on capitalism and greed, so it doesn't shock me.
Your dad actually was resistant to a lot of things that would have been quick hit money things for him, like I'm thinking of the television deal. Wasn't he presented a television deal and he said, no, I don't want to do it?
You want to hear this story? He was presented a television deal. He said no to. I, in fact, went to him many, many times and said, Dad, we can expand, your company and build this huge empire. And he looked at me and he said, how many cheeseburgers can I eat a day? He didn't care. He drove a Chevy. He was not an ostentatious, flashy guy. He didn't have private planes and yachts, and he was a very simple guy, very simple life. Although he was complicated, and but as far as materialistic things, he wasn't into that. He didn't bet on horses, so he didn't have homes around the world. So in that regard, he was simple, and he just didn't want it to get so big. And the reason why he didn't want the paper to expand beyond where he had it. And he gave me the reason because we used to fight about it. I said, I don't get this. And he said to me, Paul, if it gets any bigger, he would lose control. And he hated to delegate things. He was a quintessential micromanager. He knew how high the grass was. He knew how many paper clips there were. He knew they were stealing pens. I mean, he knew every facet. I mean, he did. He knew if there were waters out of the refrigerator. I mean, he was brilliant that way. If something was out of place, he knew it.
Well, I just think of also the fact that the tone he set with that paper as it evolved, you talk about the Gary Hart thing, and in the 80s, it did birth huge television projects, and for him to resist that, it must have taken a lot. I'm talking about, Ripley's Believe It or Not, and That's Incredible, A Hard Copy, A Current Affair, Entertainment Tonight. These are all tabloidy type shows.
Inside Edition. That
were all coming up, yeah. So, for him to lay off that took a lot. He really had pride in this being a paper.
He did, and he stuck to that. I mean, look, Ripley's Believe It or Not now has a National Enquirer attraction in Memphis and somewhere else. Look at the Entertainment Tonight. Look at the movie they just did on Gary Hart, I mean, it's endless the things he could have done, but he stayed true to, and he was right to some extent. Think about it this way. If he did a TV show or something else, and I would always ask why. Why won't you do this? And his answer was he felt, and I think he was right, they would take away from the circulation of the paper.
Right. I think you say in the book, we're here to sell papers, not soap or something like that. Right. We're not here. Not advertising on television.
He just wasn't into it. And no matter how you would try to get him to do it, although it could have made billions and billions of dollars, he didn't care. It's just what he's an old newspaper man.
This story, Paul, is really something because it takes you through generations of immigrants who built an empire of one sort and then it evolved into an empire of another sort. What ultimately then happened to the National Enquirer and to your family's relationship with the Enquirer, and how do you look at it all today?
Well, today, I mean, again, when my father passed, it was 1988. And again, it was a follow the money story. I was the favorite son. Pete Peterson was the executor of the estate. By the way, my father's money funded the Blackstone Group to a large extent.
Pete Peterson was the former Secretary of Commerce, right?
Under Nixon. And then he started a thing called the CFR. Anyway, he went to MIT with my dad, and Pete got kicked out for cheating.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Oh yeah. And so my father hired Pete in the mid 70s, even I think before the Blackstone Group. Before Blackstone, I think he hired him to be his financial advisor. Anyway, so there was a lot of money in the paper. Pete and I never really saw eye to eye. I guess you could say I would say Pete was my nemesis. He took advantage of my father, and my father was cognizant of it. He knew it, but Pete just wasn't like one of these all-weather friends. So after my father passed, and it's in my book, the last one I did, The Deeds. It says in the afterward, in the epilogue, guys, the first 3 phone calls that came in, and that's why I always say follow the money, were from Pete Peterson, Jerry Traum, and Henry Bose. They were the executors of the estate. And the first thing they asked to speak to me, I mean, my father had been passed for 2 hours. Sorry to hear about your father. And then they, after that, said, they proceeded to ask me, do you know what's going to happen with your father's company? My father's been dead for 2 hours.
Wow, that's so
unlike
cool.
the rest of the family who was waiting to see how much money they got, could care less. I mean, I lost the most important thing in my life. And it's in the afterwards. So, I then, in 1999 and 2000, I hired Jack Palladino, not to be confused with Pelicano, and I hired Terry Lenzner, the top 2 PIs and lawyers in the world at the time, for 3 things to prove. Again, for me, it was more of a cathartic thing. I wanted to prove that there was complicity in the sale of the paper, which they were able to do, that there was a second will, and other things as well. So I'm sitting here on all of this. So it's and again, I always say follow the money. So, but to bring it present day to answer your question, I see what's happened now, and it doesn't shock me. Pecker was attracted to wealth and money. It's not shocking that he went with Trump. I mean, birds of a feather flock together. I mean, there's no great surprise here. I'm not into bad-mouthing people, so it is what it is, But when I see what's happened present day to the paper, I think perhaps Pecker maybe got too caught up in the hype of all this, and it can be, I guess, hypnotic to some extent if he wasn't used to it. And in the end, those types of events were the demise of the paper, in recent times. And, it's funny because I was recently pitched to try and come in and do a takeover and get some people to come in and take the paper over, as I did back in 1989. By the way, let me go back to 89. Sorry, I raised $400 million. There was a 3% rule at the time, and the company was sold for $412.5 million. Amazing, right?
Jeez.
It's all the money. The first lawyer I hired, interestingly enough, was a guy by the name of Richard Benveniste, who was also a Watergate lawyer. So I had some pretty powerful lawyers and people on my team at the time.
And this is to buy the paper back at that point?
Correct.
Okay.
This was in 1989. So when I was recently, to bring it present day, pitched on doing this, my knee-jerk reaction was, wow, emotionally, this would be kind of a cool thing to get from a legacy standpoint to have this. This is pretty cool,
What happened to the effort in 1989?
I didn't get it. It was sold to one of Pete's friends. No great surprise, right? The McFadden Group. And again, there was a ton of cash in the company. Again, my father didn't have hobbies like racing horses and yachts, and so there was a lot of money in this paper. So they cashed out. They cashed out, and
okay.
It's all the money.
So now back to present day. Okay, and you're saying just a couple.
Sure. Now back to present day. Recently, I'm pitched to put a group together to take the paper over again. And at first glance, I thought, this could be cool from a legacy standpoint. Let me do it, And then, not soon after that, I'm 51. I thought, this is the dumbest thing ever. I mean, the circulation is down to 200,000. Everything about the paper is failing. The way we get news today, it's not on a weekly basis.
It ain't your papa's paper anymore.
No, and listen, look at all the legal entanglements it has now. Look, it is such a tainted thing right now. So I there's no way. In fact, I even went too far as to say, and I'm pretty sure I'm going to be right on this, that if they gave the paper away, that I don't think you could never resurrect it ever to where my father had it. But more importantly, you would need an infusion of capital of 50 to 100 million, just even if you wanted to start and compete with all the online things. It's a very saturated field, as you know. It's so I just don't see it. Look, everything, almost all businesses are cyclical, and you have to kiss it goodbye and say, listen, it's something of, the legacy of my father and the Enquirer will go on in perpetuity. There's no doubt, especially now.
Sure.
But the paper itself making money now.
The Deeds of My Fathers is the book from Paul David Pope. You mentioned one thing before we let you go. You mentioned that there were 2 wills and that you had hired these private investigators that revealed there was a second will or something. What do you mean by that?
Well, that is a huge story. Pete Peterson, after my father passed, after the phone calls came in, I then demanded there be an autopsy. They wouldn't allow it. And usually with a public figure, that's normal.
Wait a minute. You can't get an autopsy for your own dad?
I asked, but they were in charge and they wouldn't do it.
Pete Peterson and the other guy?
Yeah, all of them.
Okay, go ahead.
But it gets worse. So then they ordered a break-in to my father's office. His office was locked after he passed, and that's where he kept his will. So they broke into his office, the Blackstone Group, Peterson and his guys, and took what was, any evidence of another will. There was so much cash in the company, I guess, and this is, I'm glad you touched on this because I am going to do a book on my own life and put some of this in there, and it's not to look. I don't care what people think. The truth is the truth. I'm not looking to hurt anybody, but the bottom line is I've been dealing with this my whole life. So you can imagine it's like an 800-pound gorilla on my back every day. But I just want the truth to be told. I want the vindication. And, let the court of public opinion, people can figure it out for themselves. But
so they break into the office and and you're saying in that act they suppress the will? Or I don't know. I'm unclear as to how the will is played out. There's one will, but it turns out there's a second will?
Right. So are you ready for this?
Yeah.
You'll appreciate this because you're a smart guy. So my father had his will probably updated twice a year. People of that magnitude. The will that was probated was a 1983 will. Okay? So there's a lot of things here that just
So they
don't
took
smell
the will that offered them the most opportunity to, in essence, rape the company financially.
Yes. Exactly. And it would not – I was too young. I was only 20. Even with a management team, though, I could have regained control of the paper. But, again, in that scenario, they couldn't have raped the company, as you said, and they couldn't have done what they did.
Wow. So they suppressed that second will. That's your point.
Absolutely.
Wow. What a story. I mean, a great yarn. The Deeds of My Fathers from Paul David Pope. Yeah, congratulations on a life well led with a lot of intrigue and still, I'm sure, a lot of other interesting projects ahead of you, Paul.
Yes, no, Mark, thank you. A lot to come, and I'll keep you in the loop.
Please do. We'll have a link to your book on our website, edge-show.com. It'll click you right through to The Deeds of My Fathers, and you can pick it up. So thanks, Paul. Until next time.
Thanks, Mark.
The Deeds of My Fathers is the book from Paul David Pope. You mentioned one thing before we let you go. You mentioned that there were two wills and that you had hired these private investigators that revealed there was a second will or something. What do you mean by that?
Well, that is a huge story. Pete Peterson, after my father passed, after the phone calls came in, I then demanded there be an autopsy. They wouldn't allow it. And usually with a public figure, that's normal.
Wait a minute. You can't get an autopsy for your own dad?
I asked, but, they were in charge and they wouldn't do it.
Pete Peterson and the other guy?
It gets worse. Yeah, all of them.
Okay, go ahead.
But it gets worse. So then they ordered a break-in to my father's office. His office was locked after he passed, and that's where he kept his will. So they broke into his office, the Blackstone Group, Peterson and his guys, and took what was, any evidence of another will. There was so much cash in the company, I guess, and this is, I'm glad you touched on this because I am going to do a book on my own life and put some of this in there, and it's not to look. I don't care what people think. The truth is the truth. I'm not looking to hurt anybody, but the bottom line is, I've been dealing with this my whole life, so you can imagine it's like an 800-pound gorilla on my back every day. But I just want the truth to be told. I want the vindication, and let people, the court of public opinion, people can figure it out for themselves. But
so they break into the office and they get. And you're saying in that act they suppress the will, or I don't know. I'm unclear as to how the will is played out. There's one will, but it turns out there's a second will.
Right. So are you ready for this?
Yeah.
You'll appreciate this because you're a smart guy. So my father had his will probably updated twice a year. People of that magnitude. The will that was probated was a 1983 will. Okay, and So there's a lot of things here that just don't
they
smell
took
right.
the will that was most generous, that offered them the most opportunity to, in essence, rape the company financially.
Yes, exactly. And it would not – I was too young. I was only 20. Even with a management team, though, I could have regained control of the paper. But, again, in that scenario, they couldn't have raped the company, as you said, and they couldn't have done what they did.
Wow. So they suppressed that second will. That's your point.
Absolutely.
Wow. What a story. I mean, really, such great stuff. I don't know how you decide what stories to tell and what stories to leave out for the next book, but a great yarn. The Deeds of My Fathers from Paul David Pope. Yeah, congratulations on a life well led with a lot of intrigue and still, I'm sure, a lot of other interesting projects ahead of you, Paul.
Yes, no, Mark, thank you. A lot to come, and I'll keep you in the loop.
Please do. We'll have a link to your book on our website, edge-show.com. It'll click you right through to The Deeds of My Fathers, and you can pick it up and load it onto your Kindle or get a hard copy or however you want to do it. But you can begin the read. So thanks, Paul. Until next time.
Thanks, Mark.
There's a click-through for Paul Pope's book on our website, edge-show.com. Thanks to Jay Elvis. Thanks to you for listening. And until next time, bye-bye.
Hello, this is Morgan Freeman, and I want to thank you so much for all the ways that you support my friends on The Edge with Mark Thompson. You know, you can listen on iTunes, Stitcher, Overcast, iHeartRadio, and many places that great podcasts are heard. That's an oxymoron, by the way. Great podcasts. Or you can go to their website, edge-show.com. Well, still haven't purchased a new domain name, I see.
edge-show.com.